Managing Project Risk is one of the optional units which is in the SCQF Level 8 Diploma in Project Management awarded by AEL. This is for the SVQ. In this video we're just going to go over the unit guide and explain what the criteria means, what sort of evidence would cover those particular criteria. In the unit summary and the unit description for this unit explains that risk management is the process that allows individual risk events and overall risk to be understood and managed proactively, optimising success by minimising threats and maximising opportunities. So risk is all about planning what can go wrong and putting in contingencies, but also it's about maximising opportunities as well. So it's not just focusing on risk, but also the opposite of that is maximising opportunities as well to increase success for the project. This unit is at SCQF Level 8 and there's 9 credit values for this unit. The unit is split into 3 learning outcomes. The first is about being able to develop a risk management plan. This is part of the project planning phase, and this is where you'll be planning out the risk management plan. Outcome 2 moves on to the project delivery phase, and this is being able to maintain and implement a risk management plan. So this is when your project is ongoing and you're monitoring risk levels, you're monitoring events to see if a risk has occurred, and if it has occurred, you're putting in your contingency plans. And outcome 3 is being able to evaluate the risk management methods used within a project and drawing lessons for future projects. This is a reflective piece on your experience planning and managing risk. So on the first outcome, the first criteria 1.1, identify individual and overall threats and opportunities related to the project. This is quite simply you identifying during the planning stage what are the likely threats and what are the likely opportunities that is related to your project. And there'll be a variety of techniques which you may use to identify them and to put together this plan. The techniques you use will depend on the project you're working on, your organisation and the industry that you're in. The idea here is quite simply to identify what those overall threats are. One of the techniques, for example, would be to look at lessons learned. So if your organisation has done similar projects in the past, maybe you'd review previous project plans to see what went wrong there. You could use some input from that in your current project. Maybe look at other projects other organisations have done and look at what went wrong there, or previous experience. You could also do communication, brainstorming, working with stakeholders to identify what the risks are. But whichever technique you use will be specific to your project. Performance-wise, you want to be reflecting on a time where you're identifying risks. How did you identify the risks? What methods did you use to identify those risks? And what were the risks that you identified for your project? Product evidence for this would be communication with stakeholders, if that was the technique they used to identify and agreeing risk. If you use lessons learned from a previous project, perhaps that documentation may be product evidence as well. Your risk management plan or your business case where you're outlining risks could also be used as product evidence. 1.2 is assess the potential impacts of the individual and overall threats and opportunities related to a project. So this is, you've identified what they are and now you're assessing them. How dangerous are these risks? Or how much opportunity is involved in any particular opportunity. There's different techniques you can use to assess them. The most common one is power and influence grids. You give it a rating, probability and impact grids. So that is where you assess it based on probability, so that is a likelihood that event is going to happen, and impact is how severe the impact would be on the project if the event did happen. So there could be something that would have an absolute devastating effect on your project and would be rated perhaps a 10 on a scale of 1 to 10 on impact. But on the probability scale, it's maybe a 1 because it's very unlikely to happen, in which case you're probably not going to spend a lot of time managing that risk or putting too much contingency in place because it's unlikely to happen. But a risk which is quite likely to happen and would have a medium to severe impact on the project, those are the ones you're going to focus on first of all. And the way you do that is by giving them a scale. That will depend on your organisation, your project, what the scale is. But let's say it's 1 to 10, and you'd multiply the two numbers together for impact and probability, and that would give you an overall rating. That way you can prioritise them and put risks in an order. So something like that. That is one technique. You might be using different techniques in your project, but that's what we're talking about when we're saying assess the potential impacts of individual and overall threats to a project. So performance task, tell me about a time where you were identifying risks. What were the individual risks? What method did you use to assess those risks? And what was the probability and impact of that risk occurring? And what are the opportunities to the project from any risks, or what are any opportunities, and how to what extent are those opportunities there to maximise? Product evidence would be a power and influence grid or a SWOT analysis, including written analysis. That's another technique, SWOT analysis, you could use. It's also PESTLE. 1.3 is prioritise the threats and opportunities using qualitative and quantitative risk analysis. So that is you now prioritise them, and I mentioned a wee bit about that there on the previous slide, where you're multiplying the two together. That will give you a combined score, and you're then prioritising. So the ones with the highest combined score would be prioritised first. The ones which are lower down on the score would be prioritised last. So that's one example. Quantitative risk analysis or quantitative analysis is any form of analysis where you're using numbers. Think quantity, numbers. Qualitative is anything that can be expressed in words. So it could be that you're doing this power and influence graph and you're multiplying it together. That would be a quantitative risk analysis because it's an analysis that's expressed in numbers. A qualitative method might involve doing a brainstorming session with stakeholders to prioritise what do you think based on your stakeholders' experience would be a more severe risk to this project than others. Because that report would be expressed in words typically, and that'd be qualitative. So that's what those two mean. And you want to have evidence of both to cover this criteria. Performance tasks, you want to tell me about a time when you're identifying a risk and you're planning out risks. What qualitative methods did you use to assess the risk and opportunities? What qualitative methods did you use to assess the risk and opportunities? So that's qualitative and quantitative. How did you carry this out, and what were the risks to your project in order of priority? So what technique did you use to put it into that order? Product evidence would be a risk assessment of the overall threats and opportunities, perhaps using a RAG status or using some form of calculated impacts, a document outlining what you've done. Could also be done on your project management software if it's not a document. 1.4 is assess different stakeholders' appetites for risks and the implications of the development of responses. Each stakeholder that you deal with will have a different appetite for risk. Some stakeholders might be open to risk and taking lots of risks, others will be very risk adverse. So you've got to assess your stakeholders to what extent they could put up with risk and what risk they're happy with. Because if you give them a task to do and there's too much risk associated with it, then they won't complete it, they'll refuse to complete it, and that will cause that particular activity potentially to fail. So it's important to understand what appetite there is for each of your stakeholders regarding risk. So tell me about a time you're identifying risk. How did you assess each stakeholder for their appetite towards risk? What implications does this have for the development of responses? Who were your stakeholders and what was their level of risk? Stakeholder analysis for risk appetite, relationship map or stakeholder map where you're putting in their appetites for risk. This one's a bit harder to have an holistic statement around planning risks, but it could potentially be tied into a holistic statement around stakeholders, perhaps, but it depends on what evidence that you're putting together. 1.5 is plan responses to threats and opportunities which will minimise detrimental effects and or provide best value. So 1.5 could probably be tied into some sort of holistic evidence which covers this outcome as a whole quite easily. So planning responses, you've identified your risks, you've prioritised them using various methods, and now you're going to plan responses to those threats and opportunities. So should those threats or should those opportunities arise, what do you do to either maximise the opportunity or minimise the threat? So what's your contingency? So for this one, tell me about a time where you were identifying risks. How did you plan the responses to the threats and opportunities which minimised the detrimental effects? And how did these responses also maximise opportunities and provide best value for the project? What were these responses for the main risk the project faced? So try and outline in your evidence or have evidence that outlines what you've contributed towards this, but also what those contingency plans are. Product evidence could be a mitigation responses, so that could perhaps be a table where you've got your risk and what your contingency plans are. Could be a risk register with contingency actions. Could be some area, some tool on your project management software which manages this. 1.6, recommend a risk management plan that addresses the risks and opportunities, that identifies their ownership and it takes account of the different stakeholders' attitudes, and it minimises risks and maximises opportunities. Quite simple, it is you then taking all of that work that you've done, all that analysis that you've done, and you're putting together into a risk management plan that can be either on project management software or it could be like a Word document or something along those lines, of PowerPoint, however it is that you're formatting your plans for your organisation and for your project. But basically that is you bring it all together. It's very easy to put that into a holistic statement. I'd highly recommend, if you're putting evidence together, to do it holistically around this outcome. Performance tasks, tell me about a time where you're identifying risks. How did you contribute to a risk management plan? How did the risk management plan identify the risks and opportunities and their owners? How did it take into consideration different stakeholder attitudes? And how did it maximise risk and minimise risk and maximise opportunity. Product evidence would be a risk management plan which you have contributed to, or a mitigation responses within a risk plan which you've also contributed towards. 1.7, communicate this risk management plan and seek their agreement. So that's agreement with stakeholders. So this one's just that you've put this plan together and you're now ensuring that it's got signed off, or all your stakeholders who have to have a say in this are quite happy with it and have said that's fine to go ahead, and that is the plan. So tell me about a time where you've identified the risks, produced a risk management plan, summarise the main points, who were the stakeholders you communicated the plan to, how did you communicate it to, what was the reaction, what was the response, how did you know an agreement had been reached, and how did you document this. For product evidence, this should be your communication, so email, instant message, SharePoint site, Teams, group, Slack, Trello, whatever it is that you're using, some form of communication with your risk plan attached, and a screenshot of you saving your risk. It could be a screenshot of you saving your risk plan in a shared drive or SharePoint or whichever system you use. 2.1. Update the risk register. This new information becomes available, and recommend revisions to response plans and the risk management plan as required. Performance task for this one is to tell me about a time where you have dealt with changes to risk. So this is now the project delivery phase where you're monitoring risks as the project is ongoing, and you have identified that a new risk has happened. You've been able to identify it. You've then been able to update the risk register, so maybe the red, amber, green status, or if it's done in some sort of numerical way, or if it's a tool on your project management software, whichever your process is, you've updated the risk register, and then you're recommending revisions. So you've identified this is what the risk is. Now, what revisions can take place, can we do to overcome this risk, to minimise it, or if it's an opportunity to maximise it. There is some overlap with this, with the change management outcome in the scope management unit, and if the risk is associated with, if it's a risk to schedule, there's overlap in the schedule unit, and if there's a risk to resources, there's an overlap in the resource unit, or any other, a lot of your other units, there's outcomes in there that's about monitoring progress and managing change. If that's the case, if it's to do with, if the change is to do with a risk being realised, then there is some overlap here, and this could be perhaps done as a part of holistic evidence. So tell me about a time where you've dealt with changes to risk. What was the change? How did you identify the change? What revisions to the risk management plan did you identify and recommend? Product evidence would be your updated risk management plan. So perhaps your risk matrix or risk register. 2.2 is trigger plan responses to realise threats or opportunities and take steps to update the project scope, schedule, financial, quality and resourcing plans as required, as well as to the risk management plan. So this is you now taking action, you're following the correct change management process, and you're triggering these plan responses. Now if they're planned responses, it might be you don't necessarily have to go through the full change control process because it's already sort of been pre-approved, if you like. But if it hasn't, or if that's part of your organisational procedure, then you'd have to do that. If it's considered sort of pre-approved because it's in the plan already, you're happy to trigger it. There might be some approval that you require, so you'd have to make sure you get the correct approval, and then you'd make those changes. And that would have an effect on other areas of the project plan, such as scope, schedule, financial, quality and resourcing plans, and also to the risk management plan itself. So it's just to be aware that just because you're triggering a response to a threat, you also have to make sure that you update any, because it has knock-on effects on other areas of the project plan. Performance task-wise, tell me about a time where you are managing risk. What tools and techniques did you use to monitor risk? How did you identify any risks that had occurred using these techniques? And how were these techniques cost-effective and efficient? Product evidence would be screenshots or documents showing the implementation of any risk management techniques. 2.3 is deploy a complementary suite of risk management techniques that offers optimal cost effectiveness and efficiency. So this is you using your risk management techniques, and you're doing it in a way that's cost effective, and that will vary quite a lot between organisation, projects and industries. So whatever your techniques you're using to manage risk, whichever techniques you're using to monitor risk, whichever reports that you're analysing, the way that you're formatting them, the way you're saving them, communicating them, if you're doing it on a PDF, if you're doing it on a spreadsheet, if you're doing it on SharePoint, if you're doing it on Primavera P6, depends what your organisation is doing, but it's whatever technique that you're using to manage your risk, you want to explain that you're doing it in a way that's effective and efficient. So performance tasks, tell me about a time where you were managing risk. What was the threat? What was the planned response outlined in the risk management plan? What impact did the planned response have on scope, schedule, financial, quality and resourcing plans? Did the response create any new risks? and what was the outcome of triggering that response. Product evidence would be a risk plan outlining planned responses, communication implementing planned responses, or a report on implementation of a planned response. A risk plan update could also be a risk plan updated showing changes to the risk. Now moving on to the final outcome for this unit, which is the reflective piece, which is looking at alternative methods that you could have used for various aspects of risk management. This is similar to the last outcome in a lot of the project management units, where you have to ensure that each item on the list there has been covered, and this can be done as one isolated piece of evidence, or it could be part of multiple different holistic pieces of evidence. Now, if it's part of multiple pieces of evidence, for example, in a statement where you are looking at assessing potential impact, you're talking about you're reflecting on you're reflecting on alternative methods, then that could be mapped into that one item on the list, but you'd still have to get another piece of holistic evidence that looks at responding to identified threats and opportunities, and within that holistic evidence you have to be reflecting on alternative methods to do that, in which case you could take that item off. But basically you're looking for each of these items on the list, assessing potential impacts, prioritising, assessing stakeholders' appetites for risk, responding to identified threats and opportunities, and managing and maintaining the risk management plan for each of these things. You have to be able to evaluate alternative methods, so explain the methods that you've used, make some form of judgment as to whether it was effective or not, and perhaps explain other methods that you didn't use which could have been useful. Performance-wise, this is just reflective, so reflect on your experience managing project risk. For each of the listed areas, what were the techniques which you have used on your project? What worked well for each technique, and what could have worked better? Are there other techniques which you could have used? Product evidence would be a review document or perhaps a reflective account. So thanks for listening, and hopefully that helps you gather some evidence for this unit.